All right, so I'm going to talk about the fact that, ladies and gentlemen, it's never about the money. We're here for a higher purpose. It's always about the money. So this is going to be high-level impressionistic, stir the pot, get you thinking, maybe get you a little steamed, and you're welcome. So we've made kind of a strange world. Between when I started and now, we have introduced policymakers, bureaucrats, politicians, and funders into scholarly publishing, and we're facing a lot of unintended consequences because of that. We now have academics who are purposely misusing the impact factor to advance their careers with the H-index and other things. Library budgets are constrained, that's creating tensions. Academic institutions are raising tuition as endowments increase. It's especially true in the US. There are, in the US, increasing inequities in access to higher education. It's my contention that we're backing policies that will only make things worse, that we are gutting a generation of promising scientists, and that new ideas don't promise to solve these root problems. So, hi. And we have core problems. There's an eroding trust in the scientific communication process, inadequate funding to support the scientists who have been trained to work as scientists. There are trends toward more centralized power in the system. What was thought to decentralize and democratize publishing and access to the literature is actually centralizing it. There's a lack of purpose and effort and no clear shared goals. Is it quantity? Is it quality? Is it more literature? Is it data? Is it? There's technophilia in place of actual substantive ideas. We just want more technology, and some politically and financially naive and self-defeating behavior. Now, what in the world do you mean? We recently did some research, this is a little fuzzy, on when I was at AAAS, on the life cycle of a scientist from birth to retirement, and they would draw their own life. And you'll notice this. This was the most common thing in their career path, was the question mark up here. They feel like they are highly trained, yet not competent to have careers. They don't know how to have them. They don't know what the steps are. They feel like they need to know those. At the same time, we're training more scientists than ever. Between 2000 and 2008, China went from Japan-sized in the number of working scientists to larger than the United States. Within the United States, there are more scientists trained than ever. And if you are from the US, you probably read The Onion, even if you're not. And they nailed this with seek funding step added to the scientific method. For the NIH, National Institutes of Health, the older scientists are hanging on. They're consuming a lot of funding, and that's keeping a lot of younger investigators out of the field. They aren't published, and you get a lot of stasis of ideas too. If you talk to actual scientists, their top concern is funding. The younger scientists are checking out. There's too many of them. The older scientists are hanging on too long on top of that. Their top concern is funding. Their careers are too uncertain. In the US, at least, their contracts are unfair and research feels like serfdom. And their top concern is funding. In the US, the NIH appropriation in constant dollars is now about $5 billion less than it was just over 10 years ago. The growth rate in funding for research has slowed significantly from 6.3% between 1994 and 2004 to less than 1% in the subsequent years. In the US, the amount spent on research pales in comparison to the amount spent on taking care of sick people and having the war machine that we have and taking care of old people. You would think, if you were a policymaker, maybe you would spend more here and see these get cut a lot because people are healthier and not getting as sick. In Europe, last January, there was a proposal to cut science funding out of Horizon 2020 by $2.7 billion. And then in a perfect exercise of beautiful spin control, Parliament and scientists both claim a win in May by saving $500 million off of those cuts. So it's only 2.2 billion euros. So research money is being cut everywhere. There was recent progress in the US. An omnibus spending bill restored $2 billion to the NIH, gave 5 and 6, 4, 1.6 and 1.4% increases to other areas. However, if you try to get back to where we were in 2012, you're not there yet. Only the Department of Energy gets back to above 2012 levels. And you'll notice how politically driven this is in the US. The Environmental Protection Agency, which annoys the dominant political party in the legislative branch, happens to be the one that has its funding cut the most. Even though we have a nice global warming problem. To quote the fine person who invited me to speak here, and I don't think it was so he could see this again, the number one issue in public access is the public funding of science. If there isn't research, there's nothing to publish, there's nothing for the public to benefit from, there's just silence. Now we get into higher education and some of the money issues in there. In the UK, higher education providers have shifted as funding body grants have diminished. So you'll notice more and more tuition fees and educational contracts coming onto the scene as funding body grants have dropped. In the US, you compare 1960, and this nice little pink wedge up here, childcare and education was 2% of a household budget in 1960. In 2013, it's 18%. So what diminished between those years? Clothing, food, and housing. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs kind of got pushed aside. In the US, we have huge semi-pro leagues in our universities that are absorbing a lot of tuition and fees. And this is becoming quite the story. Some universities it works, some universities it doesn't. Some of the largest ones spend a lot of money off of their tuition and fees to support what are basically semi-pro teams in their midst. One of the governors of Wisconsin cut $250 million from universities to build a basketball arena. So we have strange priorities around this. These are the macro issues that we have to face. So now we get into something a little closer to home, library budgets. And as a share in the US of institutional budget, back in 1982, libraries had 3.7% of the institutional budget. They commanded slightly less than 4% of the institutional budget. So 2011, they commanded about 1.8%, or about half of that. And you'll notice this little dip right here, which is I like to call the pets.com or internet insanity dip. This is back when everybody thought the internet was going to make everything so cheap and so free. So that's when they really got their budgets cut. So how are they affording all of these publications? Well, it takes a little math. If you take that decrease and you multiply it by the increase in tuition in US colleges, you get this. And sorry for the things over here. They're not, I had an Excel problem. I have to admit it. I did not curate my data properly. But you get the gist. If the libraries had held on to that 3.7% of the university budgets, this is what they would have, about double. And would we be talking about the same topics? So you've got really good semi-pro teams at universities, but you don't have a library budget that's even 3.7% of their overall spend. Meanwhile, the number of papers published per year continues to grow. Between 2000 and 2010, we had the number of papers that were published in the prior 30 years. My favorite chart is this, which is the actual price per serial has only gone up after a bit of adjustment by 9%. It's the number of serials that has increased. This is a volume problem, not a pricing problem. There's just so much science to publish. And we get back to that demographic trend of how many scientists there are and how many of them need to publish and how many are producing interesting work and so on and so forth. So this is a trend that's been driven by all sorts of different larger demographic trends. Harvard in 2011 or 12, I think it was one of the two, claimed that the journal bundles were simply too expensive. They couldn't afford them. But if you looked at their budget, this was their total library budget. This was their salaries, so 118 million, 119 million, about 39 million for salaries, about 42 million for materials, about 9 million for journals, about 3 million for bundles, and then about 22 million they called unattributed. So if I were managing that budget, I know what I'd do. Now, at the same time, and we're talking a lot about investment in infrastructure, and I'm going to point to one publisher not because I'm being mean, but because it's new. And it's just as interesting that the new still has the same habits. So this is a new nonprofit publisher that has been very successful. And what's interesting is, as they've had success, their retained earnings have matched. In fact, as a percentage of their retained earnings, it's more than 50%. Not uncommon. These are some other nonprofit publishers. And their large endowments, retained earnings, it's mostly retained earnings, if not all. Now that may look excessive, until you look at this. Harvard University, $30-some billion. MIT, $12 billion. If you add up all those publishers I showed you before, that's where they are, all summed up. So you have a lot of people in science, higher education, sitting on a lot of money, and if we have problems, there's apparently some cash we can spend. What's also interesting is the average return on these endowments is 15.5%, but they spend about 4.4% out of it. So they could even spend 3 times as much and still increase their endowment year over year. So this caught the attention of the New York Times. Victor Fleischer. Last year, Yale paid about $480 million to private equity fund managers as compensation to manage about $8 billion, 1/3 of their endowment. Only $170 million was earmarked for tuition assistance, fellowships, and prizes. Now, Malcolm Gladwell, who some of you might love to read, like I do, caught wind of this as a Yale alum and said, I was going to donate money to Yale, but maybe it makes more sense to mail a check directly to the hedge fund of my choice. This is really also a very interesting chart to me. You go over here, and I'm sorry it's a little hard to read. Community colleges are here in the US, regional colleges, a flagship college, so state university, private low endowment, private medium endowment, and private high endowment. Getting Pell Grants is supposed to be based on need. The private high endowment universities get the lion's share in the US. So you have the richest universities getting the most financial assistance. That's backwards. So there was a radical proposal in a report called Rich Schools, Poor Students, which was to tax at an average rate of 1.36% the endowments of private universities and colleges. That would yield about $5 billion, which would make it so that 9 million good students could go to community college for free. Nobody's biting. And this gets back to one of the things, people have all these proposals about how we're going to spend our money. There is no more angelic way to spend your money, really. And nobody will do it. People protect their money. If you look across the publishing industry, it's asymmetrical. 7.4% of the companies own 71% of the revenues. And this is skewing even higher. This gets back to where the concentration is going. And it's interesting to note that when you compare that to US colleges, it's about the same. It's not that far off. In fact, they're potentially even more concentrated. When we look at The RCUK funding, most of it went to the large and continues to go to the large publishers. It's an efficiency-based model. That makes total sense. Estimates are that it'll be more expensive to go full OA. One thing about journal subscriptions is they spread the cost among more people, making the cost of participation per person lower. And then the growth in OA is slowing dramatically. Of the top 20 major OA journals between 2012 and 14, you see the growth, and you see a mature market, essentially. And if you take out PLOS One, which is a huge presence in the market, it's still slowing dramatically. And most recently, Phil Davis published a post on the Scholarly Kitchen noting that 11% decrease in article volume and a 10.7% APC increase. So again, a mature market, and it's interesting, one of the biggest players is now facing enough competition that they're having to deal with the normal twos and fro's of running a business. It's not all growth. There was also, publishing online was going to be cheaper and easier. Any of you who have tried to publish online know that if you're getting just one step beyond WordPress, it's not. You have all sorts of systems that you have to build and maintain. This is the infrastructure discussion we just had. It becomes very complicated very quickly. You have very high-priced people who do very good work, and you have to really maintain it. Then you get to funding data, big and small. Data itself is not freely available, and nor is it neutral. Data is not a neutral thing, and I'll show you some examples of that. You have all of these things to do, even as just as table stakes for data: provenance, discovery, standardization, storage, accessibility. Data sharing incentives aren't clear. Why would I share it? What's in it for me? This is interesting. The National Human Genome Research Institute recently said, we don't know how we're going to fund this anymore. It's a governmental data store. They're urging the database's overseers to consider charging for use. What a novel idea. So even Flybase isn't free. Then you get into all the different issues with data that we have to think about. So this was from last year, 2014, the very end of 2014, a study in Science that showed that only with a few data points someone could track you and all your retail habits and identify you. It was easier if you were a rich woman, because rich women buy stranger things. Sorry, more unique things, more easily identifiable things that are also strange. This is my classic, one of the classic examples. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, where I live, released medical data, and there were concerns about privacy. And they said, no, 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 we've totally anonymized it. So the Boston Globe reporters said, okay, well, guess what? There are 3 common fields: zip, birth date, and sex, and we can, through that, identify what maladies the governor has. So thank you very much for that anonymized list. The name of my new company is Caldera. This comes from the Caldera in Yellowstone Park. See these squiggles up here? That made a whole bunch of people online worry that there was an imminent explosion of the caldera under Yellowstone Park and the world was going to end. Chicago would be buried under 3 feet of ash and so on and so forth. Dark days ahead indeed. Turned out it was a seismograph that was malfunctioning, but it took years. Well, it's still going on. It took months and months and months. I talked to a park ranger up there and he said, oh my God, don't even get me going on that. Because conspiracy theorists love data. All right, what's this a map of? This is a map of 3 things at once, not just the United States, continental. So there was a study that found that certain counties were primarily Republican, highly religiously conservative, and had low educational attainment. They also had the highest rates of kidney cancer in the United States. Interesting correlation, right? The same study also found that those same counties that had the primarily Republican conservative base, highly religious, and low educational attainment had the lowest rates of kidney cancer in the United States. How could that be? That's called sensationalism. They were rural counties. If you have very few people, you have a very few low chance of anyone having kidney cancer, which means you have a 0% rate. You have the lowest rates. If you have very few people and one person has kidney cancer, you have a very high rate. So this was actually a study saying that rural people sometimes get kidney cancer. Okay, we'll skip the Facebook one where everybody's spying on you, you know that. This is my favorite latest correlation. There's a website called Improper Correlations or something like that. He just wrote a book. I apologize, I'm just blanking on the name. But you'll see this is a very interesting correlation. I think we should cut back on science, spending on science, actually. We can save lives. We can absolutely save lives. I'll leave it up here for a moment so the pictures can be taken. Make it look good on social, folks. A recent report from the Federal Trade Commission in the U.S., companies should remember that while big data is very good at detecting correlations, it does not explain which correlations are meaningful: kidney cancer, suicide by suffocation, and science funding. There were 13 medical studies that generated null results. They were reanalyzed. 92% of them found that people should take more drugs. Either you should treat more patients, or you should give them longer treatment times, or you should add treatments. Only 7.6% said you should have fewer patients take these drugs. So reanalysis of the same data, and you get 92% of the findings say are pharma friendly. So same data, folks. How could it reach a different conclusion? I'll tell you how. This is from a PLOS blog, James Coyne. I have not given up in my efforts to get the data to demonstrate that this trial did not show that psychotherapy extends the survival of cancer patients. I will give him kudos for being absolutely dead on honest. Okay? He's not hiding anything. If you want better, more reproducible papers, you're going to have fewer of them. Shorter publication lists, fewer journals, and especially fewer lower-tier journals. The number of papers that are generated now cannot be maintained under more reproducible conditions. It's just axiomatic. We did a study on the Scholarly Kitchen years ago now. The feedback on traditional pre-publication peer review and post-publication peer review. I'd love to update this, but we just don't, I'm not there anymore, so can't do it. But you see all the feedback you get in pre-publication. A lot of those papers are rejected, but the authors got really good feedback from experts that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. Post-publication peer review, they got very little feedback. And the quality of expertise, more questionable. So the importance of independence, we also have to keep this in mind. Money can grease a lot of wheels, and we have to be careful about which wheels they grease. You have funders who are funding research because they have interesting questions, authors who pursue it, but they both want to know how good is it. And you need a presence in our world to tell them that, whether that's publishers or whether that's some other name to be invented yet, player to be named later. But right now it's publishers and their journals and their editors and their peer review process and so on and so forth. How good is it? Now maybe you can recreate it, maybe it needs, and it definitely can be upgraded, always is. But that's the role. So overall funding of the sciences is below par. Young scientists are abandoning ship, especially in the US. No open models are expensive to achieve and questionable value compared to other options. Financial pressures are forcing shortcuts. Science is trending to the mean. Incremental science makes publishing easier. Big data may be expensive to do right. And we have a research funding tragedy of the commons. But this is the #1 issue. So there, that's your cheery worldview of money in science. Thanks.
Right, well, we've probably got that did really well. We have got time for 1 or 2 questions, so anyone got a question for Kent? Not questioning some... Right.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for that. That's a great talk. I wanted to pick up on the idea of so many scientists leaving academia. And I wanted to just make the point that not every scientist that leaves academia drops out. That
Right.
some of us left because we wanted to do something else, and it's not necessarily that there just isn't enough money. There isn't enough money, you're right, but that's not the only reason that people leave. And I think that the flip side is that there's a very positive aspect to more PhDs being generated because more people are higher educated and they can go on to be highly educated workers and generate value elsewhere in the economy. So I just wanted to make that comment that there's a flip side to having more people leave academia and enter the general economy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point and a good point. Thank you. What we saw talking to scientists recently, though, is there's a lot of frustration and uncertainty. They feel underpaid, underappreciated, and that they were trained, misled a little bit. As far as we were trained for this, we were told this was what the world wanted, what society wanted from us. We did our part, and then you guys walked away. And so I think you're right. They're smart people. They, find other great things to do. They contribute terrifically, but that is sort of a social contract issue that I think we need to address too.
Yeah, so I think one aspect of it is that we need to improve the way on an educational level that we support young researchers in learning about other potential career paths.
Absolutely.
Because that's the thing that I see is just completely missing. So many young researchers go to their supervisor and say, I don't like this. I don't want to do this for a living. And their supervisors very often say, that would be a waste of a brain. You're too smart to leave. You have to be successful doing this.
Well, they don't know the options either.
Yeah, so there's no sense that, so there isn't enough support, there isn't enough career guidance for young researchers to do other things.
Yeah, agreed.
Oh, yeah, Fred.
Can I remind this audience that interesting young people in our career in publishing is a great career. We just heard from two, okay? And we heard this morning the importance of being well connected to our customer, who are scholars. What better way to import scholars directly into our business? And our job opportunities and career opportunities are not very well known in the academic community, and I would give that as an action item for all of us.
That's a good point.